When you've got questions, he always has an answer. It's Sean Hannity this afternoon at 2, right before Joe Walsh at 5 on AM 560. The Answer.
Dan and Amy, good morning. Alan Dershowitz on Fox over the weekend, famed constitutional lawyer from Harvard, had this to say in summary of what we learned from the Barr letter, summarizing the Mueller report.
But I think the reason he said that was to explain why he might not produce everything in the report, because they might be relevant to ongoing investigations. He had to say that, and we all know that there are investigations by the Southern District. But it's important that we did learn there are no sealed indictments, that there's no recommendation in the report for any further indictments. And so this is not what many people feared, just shifting it over to the Southern District and saying, we're not going to indict this guy, but maybe you should. That was done with the Attorney General as far as the obstruction of justice, but he didn't do it with the Southern District.
And Dershowitz went on to explain why he believes Bob Mueller should have to do the Walk of Atonement like Cersei in Game of Thrones.
And if there's an indictment, at least you have a chance to challenge it and fight back in court. But if they say, oh, you were a bad boy, you almost obstructed justice, how do you fight against that? Where do you defend yourself against that kind of charge? That's why traditionally prosecutors are not allowed to say anything about people they decided not to indict. But Mueller just couldn't resist. He's been working all these months, spent all this money, so he has to tell the American public, look, I had some people who wanted to indict, some people who didn't want to indict. Here's this argument, here's that argument. I'm leaving it to the Attorney General. Democrats will take one thing out of it, Republicans will take another thing out of it. That's precisely what prosecutors should not do. Shame on Mueller for not having the guts to come to a decision one way or the other. That's what prosecutors are paid to do.
Shame. Shame. For more on this, we're pleased to be joined by Jenna Ellis. She is a constitutional lawyer, former prosecutor, contributor to CNN, Washington Examiner, Federalist. Jenna, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me.
So do you agree with the good Professor Dershowitz that Mueller is to be shamed for not making a definitive statement about the second piece of this puzzle, obstruction?
Oh, absolutely. It was clearly a cheap shot of Mueller to say, to basically punt it and say, you know, this is going to be the Attorney General's call now, to leave open the Democrats to this line of course, you know, rhetoric that now they're pushing to say that somehow Attorney General Barr was biased, and you know, this leaves open the legal question of whether or not there was obstruction. When, you know, the line that's most important is that from the page is that I have concluded, and this is from Barr's letter, I've concluded that the evidence developed during the special counsel's investigation is not sufficient to establish that the president committed an obstruction of justice offense. And this isn't his opinion. This is a legal conclusion based in fact and objective standards. So this needs to just be closed. But I absolutely agree with Alan Dershowitz.
But it says, you know, report does not conclude the president committed a crime. It also does not exonerate him. So that leaves, you know, Democrats holding on to some hope, don't you think?
Well, not at all, because what he's saying there in legal speak is that he didn't make a decision one way or the other. He didn't reach a legal conclusion. He's simply giving all of the evidence over to the Attorney General and saying, you deal with it. And then the Attorney General, Deputy Rod Rosenstein, as well as the Department of Justice, looked then at the evidence and then said, no, we can't make a case for this at all, and they closed it. So this is not an open legal question. And, of course, people who are non-lawyers are going to take it that way to say, oh, it doesn't exonerate him. But that's not what that means in legal speak. It just means he is not reaching a legal conclusion. He's refusing to weigh in on it one way or the other. And then the Attorney General did. And he said, without a doubt, absolutely not. There is not sufficient evidence to move forward with this.
It's rather interesting if you agree with Dershowitz and analogizing this to how Comey handled the Hillary Clinton investigation. And Dershowitz, to his credit, was critical of Comey making public remarks about a case he was not going to prosecute, just as Mueller has done here. That's the comparison he's making. And and we learned after the fact, boy, Loretta Lynch was none too happy with Jim Comey either. And Rod Rosenstein cited that as the reason for Jim Comey's termination. And yet all on the left seem to have no problem with Bob Mueller doing the same to Trump, the same sort of treatment they decried. including among their comrades like Loretta Lynch and to some extent Rod Rosenstein, when Hillary was the target.
The Democrats are outcome driven, and so they can shift their position, 3 times every day, and then even more on Sundays. I mean, they just want the outcome that they want, and they're going to be activists. And rather than looking at law enforcement and prosecutors in particular as being completely unbiased, going where the evidence leads, they're now unhappy with Mueller. They're taking this one line out of the report and they're trying to spin it, just like probably Mueller expected them to. And of course they're shifting their position. I mean, but this is the same thing that they're doing with the Electoral College, trying to abolish that. They suddenly don't like a foundational institution of the American system of government just because that allowed Donald Trump to be elected and they didn't get their way. So, I mean, lowering the voting age, all of these different things, Supreme Court packing, this is just consistently what the Democrats do, is that when they don't get the outcome they want to change the rules, they want to manipulate things, and they want to spin it.
Right, like Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi released a joint statement saying that America's prosecutor is not a neutral observer and is not in a position to make objective determinations about the report.
And that's just absolutely absurd, because we've had attorney generals in the United States that have been duly, gone through the nomination and the Senate confirmation process. And A.G. Barr, let's remember, is not new to this particular type of rodeo. I mean, he was the attorney general under President Bush 41. He's had a long history of being a fine, upstanding prosecutor. There's absolutely no reason to claim that he is biased, except that the Democrats didn't get the outcome they wanted.
I mean, what is Pelosi's? Hey, let's have another special counsel to investigate the special counsel's investigation.
Oh,
I mean, it's just the idea that Barr, and by the way, it's not just that he's not an independent observer. That's not the only accusation. You have hosts on MSNBC hyperventilating about seeds of a cover-up that could be present with respect to Bill Barr, who's been in the job for 5 minutes.
Well, and suddenly, they're concerned about that when they haven't been concerned about Strzok and Page and Brennan and McCabe and the
Lynch.
list goes on.
Yeah.
I mean, again, that's and Loretta Lynch and Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama. I mean, all of these people. Where is equal justice under the law? Where is the investigation and the special counsel for everyone on the Democrat side for the 2016 election? This has been targeted only against President Trump, and in the Democrats' mind, it depends on whether a D or R is after your name solely, and they don't see that law enforcement should be objective, should be unbiased, and the investigation, I mean, they were looking at Mueller as the gold standard, and now suddenly, because they don't get the outcome they want,
now he's a Russian agent.
They're questioning everything.
Now, so let me have you translate some more legal speak here. This is from an independent, objective, neutral attorney, Neil Cattell, who was the acting Solicitor General under President Obama. That's how I know he's neutral. He writes in the New York Times, sometimes momentous government action leaves everyone uncertain about the next move. This is not one of those times. Congress now has a clear path of action. It must demand the release of the Mueller report. Then it must call Mr. Barr and Mr. Mueller to testify. Mr. Barr must explain his rationale for reaching the obstruction judgment he made. And then he goes on with more neutral language. No one wants a president to be guilty of obstruction of justice. The only thing worse than that is a president who goes without punishment. The Barr letter raises the specter that we are living in such times.
This is absurd. I mean, in what world do we ever have a prosecutor who is vested with as much time, resources, energy, everything that Mueller had, reaching this conclusion, and then suddenly Congress is saying, oh, now we're going to question that, and we're going to, bring in, and we're going to second guess. I mean, we have a separation of powers for a reason. And so for the Attorney General, he is the one ultimately that was vested with this decision. Now, special counsel could have, and it should have been Mueller who made this decision, as Alan Dershowitz said. But for Congress to now say, okay, we're going to now question the investigation, that's, again, just them wanting to perpetuate this narrative, perpetuate this myth, and hate on Donald Trump.
Thank you for the translation of lawyerese into people speak. Jenna Ellis, constitutional lawyer, former prosecutor, and a contributor to CNN, Washington Examiner, The Federalist, among others. Jenna, thanks for being with us. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me.
And she joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
If you're talking about it, Dan and Amy are talking about it. It's Chicago's Morning Answer